Hey YouTube, in this video I'm going to be doing my long-awaited RX Vega 64 review. This is going to be a gaming review, particularly for 1440p resolution, so you won't see any 1080p or any 4K because I feel like the Vega 64 is at its best at 1440p, and if you're going to be paying this much money for a graphics card, especially like a high-end graphics card, you're going to want something. You're going to want to pair it with like a 1440p monitor. So the monitor that I'm actually using is the Agon. It's made by AOC. It's a 24-inch 1440p FreeSync monitor that has 144 hertz. So the FreeSync range is 30 to 144. It's a really nice monitor. I can't believe like there are barely any 24-inch 1440p monitors. I think that's the best. It's the smallest size for the best for the like a higher resolution. So anyway, let's get right into it. The test system that I am using, as you can see here, is the Ryzen 7 1800X. It is running at stock. Everything's running at stock. The only thing that's overclocked are like the not the 1080 and the Vega, but the other graphics cards. If they're factory overclocked, I just left them at the factory configuration because it doesn't matter. They're all gonna lose to the Vega 64 by a lot at 1440p. So, but anyway, the motherboard, this is the BIOS version 1501. When I did all the tests, that's what I was running it on. G.Skill Flare X at 3200 megahertz. That's the stock for that RAM. 32 gigs. All 4 DIMMs are populated on the motherboard, and this, you can see them there. And then 1 terabyte NVMe Evo drive from Samsung. So nothing too special here. It's pretty typical test system. I guess the one thing I forgot to mention is the power supply. Power supply is a Seasonic 1000 watt titanium. It is the new Prime series that they have. It's pretty popular. It's like the most baller looking power supply. Anyway, moving on to the drivers that we're using. So Vega was tested with 17.9.1. That was the one that fixed the annoying issue where the YouTube, like if you would start up a YouTube video after you resume from sleep, because of hardware acceleration in the browser, it would be really slow and laggy. Same thing if you try to play like a video on VLC, or actually not VLC, but like a movie from Windows 10, Windows Media Player, all that stuff. Anyway, 17.9.1 is the driver I used, and then for the GeForce drivers I was using 385.28. That was the last driver that I had installed before I switched over to Vega. So prior to using Vega, I was using a Founders Edition 1080. I still have the card in storage, but yeah, I did all my testing on that. Then I swapped to Vega, and I've been using Vega 64 ever since as my daily driver. And then, as you can see, here are the other graphics cards that were tested. So my Sapphire R9 Fury Tri-X, which I still feel is the best AMD graphics card I've ever owned. It's like super quiet, and it performed really well when it came out. And then my XFX RX 480 reference card, my GTX 970 from MSI, and the Asus Matrix Platinum, representing good old faithful, the GCN 1.0 Tahiti, the 7970, the one that started it all. But as we'll see, it looks like GCN is a little long in the tooth now. I feel like AMD really needs to come out with a newer, more power efficient architecture. But we'll see in the benchmarks how well Vega stacks up to the competition. So, first game that we're looking at here is Battlefield 1 at Ultra, 1440p. This is DirectX 11. I did not use DirectX 12 for this game because I just didn't test it with DX12. I guess I could have, but this is my DirectX 11 results. And as you can see, Vega beats the 1080 by 10 FPS on average with slightly better minimums. I don't have the minimums here, but the minimums that I were seeing was like 84, and for the 1080 it was like 71. But so both are very playable. But if you look at the third down here, so the R9 Fury, you can see how that card just barely breaks 60 FPS at 1440p. So that's a huge jump. Now, granted, this is not the Fury X. The Fury X would probably be close to like 70 FPS if I had to guess, or maybe like 68 or something. But that's a huge gap of like 50%, like yeah, almost 50% scaling. So that's pretty good, I would say. A lot of that is the clock speed advantage that Vega has over the Fury, but also it just has more like newer optimizations in the driver, I feel, compared to what the older cards have, because there was a driver fork for Vega that separated it from the typical GCN line drivers. So that's why these guys don't perform as well. I feel like AMD's investing a lot in Vega, but I think while they're fixing things, they're also kind of breaking things, so they don't want to just like backport everything to the older cards yet. But you will see these guys slowly improve over time. So yeah, 480s does okay. To me, it's underpowered for 1440 as seen here. I like everything to be at least 60 as the average, but ideally you want like 70, 80, so you have some leeway for those minimums. And then the 7970, aka 280X or whatever you want to call it, not really able to handle Battlefield 1 Ultra at 1440p. It's like 30, unless you're good with playing 30 FPS. That's basically what you get. Next, you have Call of Duty Infinite Warfare Ultra 1440p. Again, DirectX 11. Again, a win for Vega. Vega seems to do really good with Call of Duty games. Surprisingly, it does a lot better than Nvidia. Typically, AMD stuff does well in Call of Duty, and Nvidia's stuff tends to do better with Unreal Engine 4 based games. So that's what I've noticed here, at least looking at the results. Fury can handle this game decently well, so can the 480 at this resolution, but that's mainly because AMD's drivers just do really well with Call of Duty. But the 7970 is a little bit too outdated. It has no color compression. It has no, none of the newer stuff, so it's just kind of old now. And then the GTX 970 can't handle the game at 1440. 1080 does pretty good too, but it's the rival card. Next, we have one of the most anticipated games for me, at least from when it came out this year. So Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood. This is a DirectX 11 game again. 1440p maximum. So you can see it's an MMO, so don't expect super high FPS. Not really needed in an MMO. You kind of just want a good average that's above 60. So when this game came out, I was still using the Fury. Then I swapped to the 1080, and then I swapped to Vega. So it's kind of like a slight downgrade going to Vega with this game. So if you only play Final Fantasy XIV or MMOs in general, I feel like Nvidia cards tend to do better because a lot of them are DirectX 11. Now, if you're playing like an older one like Guild Wars 2, that's still DX9, so it don't really matter which card you go with. In that title, they're all going to perform about the same. So 76, it's not as good as I'd like it, but typically, this game has always favored Nvidia. It does make use of HBAO+, and it has the GameWorks logo on the benchmark, so take that for what it's worth, but I still think this is pretty respectable performance. It's a good uplift over the Fury. So it's really, in my opinion, the only card. I mean, I don't really know how the 56 would perform. Probably around 71, if I had to guess. So, yeah, the Vega cards are really the only ones that I consider good for Final Fantasy Stormblood 1440p. For 1080, Fury, RX 480, 580, that's where it's at. So next, moving on to Doom. Ultra 1440p, so as expected, AMD's drivers do really well in this game. This was benchmarked using Vulkan, the Vulkan API. And, 114... it's really good. Fury does 86, 480 does 66, and the 7970 does pretty bad. I think it's, if I had to say the reason why it kind of loses out is because it only has 3 gigabytes of RAM, and this is pushing 1440. My 480 has 8 gigabytes of memory, so it's doing 66. The GTX 970 only has 4 or 3.5 plus 512 meg. But it's able to keep up okay, I guess. But like to me, 53 for an FPS is just too low. So it's really 480 or above for this game. But Vega does manage to win over the 1080, which is pretty expected, I would say, like for Doom, for Vulcan. Next we have PUBG, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, one of the most popular, insane, like sleeper hits of the year. It just kind of like came out in early access, and like for some reason everybody's playing it, everyone's live streaming it. So this game is really popular. I like this game. It's a whole lot of fun. Every time I play this game, it's like hilarious when I play with my friends. But yeah, 58 FPS. Now the driver update did improve performance, but I feel like, I mean, people are gonna say this is an early access game. Why are you benchmarking it? Well, because a lot of people play this game, and they're probably wondering how well Vega does in this game. So it does pretty well at 1440p Ultra. Keep in mind this is Ultra, and it's like how many people actually play PUBG at Ultra. I would say this, looking at this, even though it does 58, I would drop it down to high. I wouldn't play this game at Ultra at all. Not even with the 1080, not even with the 1080 Ti if I had one. Because the frame rate is too inconsistent and jittery. So even though you see like 58 average for the Vega, 62 for the 1080, it's really not smooth like on Ultra. It's hard to explain. Like if I had minimums, it'd probably show you that it's pretty lousy. Minimums are probably like 22 on Vega. I remember seeing 22 on Vega, and 1080 I was also seeing like 26 and stuff. It's not that great. Like, yeah, so, at Ultra. So definitely play this game on high if you actually like want the game to look good and run okay. So, but yeah, this game needs a lot of work. You can tell by looking at like everything here is doing pretty bad. And the last game that I have benchmarked is Quake Champions. It's another game that it's being bundled recently with AMD's graphics cards. So I played this game in early access, or in the beta, open beta, or was it closed beta? Yeah, I think it was actually closed beta earlier in the year. So it's a really fun game. It scales very well. Doom is supposed to be a very fast, I mean not Doom, Quake is supposed to always be like really fast, fast-paced shooter. So you want it to be, you want high FPS in this game, and Vega does perform. Like it does give you the high FPS that you want. If you have a 144 hertz monitor, this Vega 64 can max out the 144 hertz, even at ultra settings for 1440p. So this is one of the few games that if you were to crank it all up to 4K, you'd be fine. 1080 does well as well. Fury 480, all of them. It's like even the mighty 7970 can play this game at 1440p ultra above 60 FPS. That's how well optimized this game is. So hopefully more games will become more multi-threaded like this game, because I think this is like a really good example of a well optimized game that it's new and is not like it's not very buggy either, and from my experience playing it. So next, let's talk about power consumption. This is probably the biggest negative that if you've watched a lot of reviews by now, you've probably heard the complaints by reviewers about power consumption, and my review is no different. I really don't like the power consumption of this card. It's just too much. Like it's if you have a R9 390X, this card uses about the same amount of power as that card, if not slightly more, when in balanced or turbo mode. It's pretty insane. Like it's a lot. It's a lot of power. To be honest, I actually run the card in power save mode on a normal basis when I play games like Final Fantasy XIV, or any other game that I don't really need. Like the only time I use balance is if I'm playing Quake Champions. That's like the only time. Like I honestly, yeah, I just use power save or undervolt. So you can see just by switching it over to power save, you drop 100 watts off of that. That's like a lot of power. Well, not 100. Here it's like 80. It's like 80 watts. It's still a lot of power cut down. Like that's the difference between a 390X and a Fury Tri-X, just about, in terms of how much power you're saving. So it dropping it to power save mode, your boost clocks are gonna drop into like, you're not really gonna exceed 1400 megahertz when you're in power save mode, and when you're in balance mode, you're gonna exceed 1500, but at the cost of, you know, a lot of power. So I know it's a lot of power. I would not consider crossfiring these cards at all, not with this type of power consumption, unless you're gonna run both of them in power save all the time, or you're just gonna like extremely undervolt them and don't do any overclocking. It's kind of ridiculous, but power save mode does drop it to the same, roughly the same level as the R9 Fury, which makes it a lot more manageable. It's also similar to the 7970 in terms of power consumption when it's in power save mode. So there is that. And hopefully, as the drivers get better, it just runs better in power save mode, so that power save mode will one day hopefully have the same performance as balanced or near balanced performance. So that's always nice. So there's that. So yeah, definitely I would say, looking at this, the next architecture or the next graphics card from AMD does need to definitely target power consumption as like a top priority, because this is kind of, you know, like, who wants to see 400 watts coming out of their wall when they're gaming for like 8 hours a day or something? It's just kind of silly. Next, noise levels. Noise is another thing that I don't like about Vega, at least when it's in balanced mode. So 45 dBA, and I will say that the maximum stock RPM speed on the fan is 2400 RPM. So take that for what it's worth. To me, 2400 RPM is loud. It's too loud. So there's another reason why I'm running it in power save mode. Power save mode, it drops it back down to like 2100, which basically makes it the same RPM as a GTX 1080 FE. But for some reason, and I did test these a couple of times to try to figure out why the 1080 does run at like 2100 RPM at gaming load, and the Vega is like at 2400 in balance. And I was trying to figure out, like, why is the Vega so much louder? But looking at the card's fans, the 1080 Founders Edition looks like it's using a higher quality fan. It may not be able to spin as fast, so in that regard, maybe the Vega one is actually more durable. But the 1080 has a more interestingly shaped radial fin array, which I think helps cut down on the noise. And it may also be a combination of the way they've placed things around, like the heat sink and the vapor chamber and all that kind of stuff. So both cards using vapor chamber cooling, but obviously Vega uses a lot more power. But I will say that the blower cooler did impress me. It did do very well. It keeps temperatures around 75 Celsius, whereas the 1080 Founders Edition keeps the card at 82 Celsius. I feel like if AMD allowed Vega to run at the same temperature, around like 82, maybe even 85 C, it would probably be quieter and more manageable. So you guys can always tune that in Wattman, but I feel like they're a little bit too aggressive at 75 C. Maybe it's because of the HBM temperatures, because the HBM on this card gets really, really hot. It gets up to like 82, 87. It gets really hot. So that might be the reason why they do it. It might be because you've got so much heat in that focused area, because the memory is like right next to the die, the GPU die. But anyway, that's power consumption, and that's noise. It's not good. It's a blower style cooler. It's a reference design. So, you know, it is what it is. But I will say that the 1080 Founders Edition has impressed me with how quiet it is for a blower style reference card. So, alright, so consideration for saving power and reducing noise. These are just basically no-brainers, but I do want to review them real quick. MMOs, Games that don't require like exceeding 60 FPS, I would consider running in-game frame limiters. That's what I do. I don't really use Radeon Chill, but I do use the in-game frame limiters, like for Final Fantasy, for example. Just cap it. Vega power save mode, use that. You're losing about 4% performance, but you're saving 100 watts. Secondary BIOS, you can save a little bit more power too, but it does cost you quite a bit more in performance if you try to go to power save mode. And you can consider undervolting. That's always fun to tweak. For overclocking, don't bother. It's not worth it. That's all I gotta say. I tried it like the first couple of days I had the card, and then just kind of like gave up and just ran it imbalanced or power save. It feels like they really pushed the RX Vega line to its limits compared to the Frontier Edition, just to be competitive with the competitor. So they're able to win more and lose less, I guess, in a lot of the games at 1440p because of this. So there really isn't a point to overclock it. So what I'm saying here is, if you really want to overclock a Vega card, buy the 56 instead. It's the same sort of argument I have for people who want to buy, like if they want to upgrade to Ryzen, they want to get a 1800X. If you're going to overclock Ryzen, it's the same logic. Buy the 1700, save money, and tweak the lower priced product. Same thing with Vega. So in conclusion, Vega 64 is the best AMD GPU for 1440p Ultra. I mean, there's no arguing that. I mean, people are going to try to say 56. 56, I would say, is probably a better deal, or I'd call it a smart buy, because you can overclock it. You can tweak it better. It's quieter. It doesn't use so much electricity. And it can also still handle 1440p almost as well as 64, but I don't think it's as future-proof. Same thing with like Fury and Fury X. Same sort of thing. It's like a repeat of 2015 with the AMD flagship GPUs. And regarding the GTX 1080, because it seems like AMD's always trying to one-up one of NVIDIA's top sellers. So like back last year, it was the GTX 970. They did it with the 480. They like targeted performance of 970 and to best it with the 480. So they succeeded, but then the 1060 came out and it was sad face for them. But you know, same thing here. They went after the 1080 because the 1080 was the new hotness or whatever, and like Vega 64 came out and was able to beat it and lose some, win some. You know, if I had to estimate though, a year from now, Vega 64 is probably going to be faster than the 1080. It's probably going to be a no-brainer that the 64 will probably age better than the 1080, considering Volta will come out sometime next year. Not really sure though. And then everything else that you saw here in the benchmarks is underpowered for 1440p, so I would consider all those like 1080p cards. And anything above the 1080 and the Vega 64, so in this case the 1080 Ti, the Titan X, Titan XP, those cards, I consider those cards too expensive, and they're overbuilt with the intention of being 4K cards, but they don't quite hit that mark. They're not, in my opinion, they're not 60 FPS capable across the board at 4K yet. So yes, they're very good for 1440p, but it's kind of not really needed for 1440p, if you get what I'm saying, because they're probably like the 1080 Ti and the Titan X. Those cards cost a lot more money. Well, maybe not a whole lot, at least in the case of the 1080 Ti, but you look at the 980 Ti, it's not aging too well. Like, it's getting beat by 1070. So, you know, that's what I mean by it's not very good value for money. So I feel like if you're going to buy an NVIDIA card, you want to go for the 104 variant. And if you're going to buy an AMD card, you kind of want to go for like the one that's one notch down from the top. So in this case, like Vega 56, or in the case of NVIDIA, the GP 104s, the GV 104s, you know, those type of cards. So anyway, guys, that's my conclusion on this review. Hope you guys enjoyed the information, and I'll see you guys next video. Thanks.